All right, welcome to Community Teamwork Fair Housing Program's brief tutorial on requesting an accommodation from our rental assistance program that administers housing subsidies. My name's Aaron Ginsberg, and I am a coordinator in the Fair Housing Program. I'm not going to read a whole lot of the slides, but I'm going to read this one. The work that provided the basis for this publication was supported by funding under a grant with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The substance and findings of the work are dedicated to the public. The author and publisher are solely responsible for the accuracy of the statements and interpretations contained in this publication. Such interpretations do not necessarily reflect the views of the federal government. All right, so we're going to do three things in this presentation. We are going to talk about what a reasonable accommodation is, how to ask for one from our rental assistance program, and then we're also going to specifically look at our reasonable accommodation form and review how to fill that form out. So reasonable accommodations are a specific civil rights protection for people with disabilities. And those protections exist under our Fair Housing Act, our Rehabilitation Act that covers federally funded programs, the Americans with Disabilities Act for businesses that are open to the public, and under our Massachusetts fair housing laws. Community teamwork follows all of these. The reasonable accommodation process is similar under all of these, and it's accessible. It's accessible through the same process. You don't need to know which law you're asking for the accommodation under. I just thought it's interesting to know that there are a variety of different ones that require our rental assistance department to engage in this process. So, who is protected from discrimination on the basis of disability? And who has this extra protection of being able to ask for reasonable accommodations? The one in bold is the one that I see most often, and it is having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. When I think about this definition of what it means to be a person with an impairment, construe it broadly. Think about it in very broad terms. Substantial limitation is not a complete limitation. If it is a mobility impairment, it doesn't mean that you can't walk at all. It just means compared to most people, you have a real limitation. Major life activity is also really broadly defined to include things like seeing, sleeping, breathing, eating, relaxing. An example I like to use here is playing cribbage or whist. This is not a major life activity, but you need to be able to do a whole bunch of different major life activities to play that game of cribbage or whist. You need to be able to hold cards in your hand. You need to be able to sit. You need to be able to concentrate or focus long enough to be able to play the game. You need to have the social connections to have people to play the game with. You need to be, there's just a lot of different major life activities. So what is a reasonable accommodation? A reasonable accommodation is a change to a rule or a practice, a policy or a procedure when you really need that accommodation to use or enjoy your housing or participate in a program like our rental assistance program, where that's not happening right because of an impairment. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but that is the entry point for this discussion. We're asking, you're putting in a request to ask community teamwork, to ask our subsidy program to change the way they run their program or do business to accommodate you because of your impairment. So, I went the wrong direction. So the reasonable accommodation process, it is a process. It is not an instantaneous thing. It is designed to be an exchange of information. It's designed to happen efficiently, and it's designed not to be cumbersome or have really long delays in it. So there are no special rules or special forms, no special words that you need to use if you need to ask for an accommodation. But it is really good if you can use that word reasonable accommodation. It is really good if you can ask for it in writing instead of orally. And it's really good if you can use a housing provider or CTI's form instead of not, because it helps you document your request. It helps you track your request. And to the extent that we're talking about using a particular form, um, there's not a requirement for it, but it is advantageous because it makes sure that the client is going to provide the information that CTI or a housing provider thinks is important. And it's pragmatically, it's also the way CTI staff have been trained to receive and respond to requests for accommodation. So anything that you can do as the requester to make that process easier for you to get through, I think it's worth doing. And I recommend this. I spend a lot of time helping folks with reasonable accommodations. And whenever we can follow the process and the procedure that a housing provider or a housing authority or administering agency wants, it always works better. So when I think about a reasonable accommodation and asking for one, there's really three questions that come up and three questions that have to be answered. And that's what this interactive process is designed to do. The first question is, does the person have an impairment? This is really simple. It is, do you belong to the group of people with impairments that are entitled to accommodations? All right, so that first part is a tenant burden, and it sort of scoots right into the next question that gets asked, which is there a connection between the way this client or tenant's impairment affects them and what they're asking to have changed? So those first two things usually happen at the same time, and both of those are the tenant or the client burden to demonstrate or assert. The process always starts with the client asking or the tenant asking for the accommodation. This is because people might not want an accommodation, and we don't want to put a housing provider or CTI in a position where they're saying, hey, Aaron, it looks to me like you have a disability and I should treat you differently because of it, right? That we don't want to do that. So we always let the tenant or the client ask first. I mean, it might be suggested if they're already asking or not doing the it might be somebody might say, hey, do you need a reasonable accommodation? Sounds like you're asking for one, but we would never start that conversation out of the blue. So you make those first two steps. That's the tenant burden, and we're going to talk about what that burden is and how you meet that burden. And then you ask, is that request reasonable? And when you ask, is that request reasonable, that really is where the burden shifts over and back onto the housing provider or CTI to say, you know what, this isn't reasonable. And in my experience, when CTI does have to say, the request you're asking isn't reasonable, it's usually because we have a federal or a state regulation that we need to follow that we're not allowed to deviate from, and granting that accommodation would bump up against that federal or state policy. If that happens, it's always appropriate to start the next conversation, which is, well, this accommodation we couldn't make isn't reasonable, but is there something else that we can do that would be effective? I guess while I want to stay on this three questions for just a moment. We talked about demonstrating that a person has an impairment and that the effects of that impairment are connected to the requested change to a policy or procedure is a tenant burden. We can also talk a little bit about how that happens and in what order that happens. There is no requirement that they sort of demonstrate the impairment or the connection when they initially request it. This overwhelmingly is supported with a letter from a healthcare provider or a doctor because that's viewed as best evidence. We're looking for something that's knowledgeable and reliable and explains the condition. But there's no need to provide it when you're asking for it. Sometimes you want to ask for it as fast as you can and then go and get that letter. Other times it's nice to package it together and put that support, if it's needed, in at the same time. I say that you don't need to have that support at the time you're asking, because if your impairment is obvious or known to CTI's rental assistance department or CTI or a housing provider, they really shouldn't be asking for any verification from it. They shouldn't be asking for any support saying you have it. So if I use a wheelchair, and I'm in CTI's office asking for an accommodation related to my mobility impairment, they should not say, Aaron, let's stop right here. Go get a letter from your healthcare provider telling me that you use a wheelchair and need an accommodation. They should say, you know what, this is obvious to me. We can move forward. And this is not just for things that you can visually verify. Um, there are cases where I've been speaking with clients on the phone, and I can tell just from a series of phone conversations that, or email exchanges, that somebody is struggling with a administrative process related to a behavioral health condition. And in cases like that, I would not ask for verification from a healthcare provider if it's known to me. I would just say, you know what? Um, I can tell that this is obvious. I'm going to do an internal verification. So that's a really long explanation for why you don't have to have that support letter with you when you initially submit it. It's great to keep it all together. If you have it ready at the same time, that's wonderful. It processes things quicker. It's just not necessary. Um, let's talk about some common requests. When we talk about the two that I think we get most in our rental assistance department are requests to extend a voucher period to find housing once that voucher has been issued and you have to move. There's a 60-day window that CTI gives. That is our policy. That's our procedure. You get 60 days to go out and find a rental. Otherwise, you are at risk of losing a subsidy. Um, Sometimes clients can't make it in that 60-day window. Sometimes they can't make it and it has nothing to do with the disability, in which case that this process won't be helpful. But if it is related to your disability, you can ask for reasonable accommodation. You can say, look, I need to find accessible housing. I have a mobility impairment. I can't get out in the community very easily to look at housing. There is a more limited housing stock that's available. There's no way I can make this rental deadline of 60 days. I need an extension. So your accommodation, your impairment is mobility related. It is affecting the way you find housing. You are asking for an extension. That's the accommodation to extend the period to look. The policy is 60 days. You need an extension to it. You've connected those two things together. That's your reasonable accommodation request. If it's a behavioral health condition that is making the administrative tasks hard to engage in, you might need a support letter. You might need something to verify it. But the idea is the same, that you can't access the process in the amount of time allowed by our policy or procedure, so you need an extension. Another really common request that we get is a request for an extra bedroom. And with the extra bedroom request, it could be because you have a helper that helps you complete your activities of daily living and they need a place to sleep. It could be because you have sleeping conditions, whether it is an inability to sleep regular schedule. It could be extra medical equipment or a special bed. There could be a variety of different reasons that you can't sleep in the same room as your partner or your spouse, in which case you could say, hey, you know what? Normally, CTI has a policy, a practice, a procedure of assigning a one-bedroom apartment voucher to my household size. But I can't do it with just one bedroom. I need that extra bedroom because of my equipment or because of sleeping or because of an aid. And now I've explained my impairment, right? I have trouble sleeping. I sleep at regular hours. I have extra equipment or I have an aid because I need help, showering and bathing and cooking and cleaning. I need it during the day and I need it at night, and this is how we're going to do it. And you've connected it to the request that you need. So this is a couple ways that we walk through this process. Then you go and you have the support letter and you fill out your form. I want to talk just briefly about the knowledgeable and reliable person's letter. I have it titled as a doctor's letter because that's what everybody calls it, but it's a misnomer. Really, it does not have to be a doctor. And let's cover some things here. What is required is that the person is knowledgeable and reliable. So it could be a social services person, it could be a family member. Um, a lot of times, community teamwork and other organizations want it to come from a healthcare provider because it is viewed as the best support or evidence of both your impairment and its connection to the request that you're making. So if you can get it from a healthcare provider, I do recommend doing that. When we talk about the letters, I like to talk about letter quality or support quality. And I think there are three things that go into a strong support letter. The first one is just introducing who's providing that support. So if I need an accommodation and I go to my nurse practitioner or my social worker or a counselor, and they're going to write a letter for me, they'll say, I'm so and so. I have a master's in social work. I've been working with Aaron for 5 years now, and I'm really familiar with his behavioral health impairments. They affect him in his ability to, fill out paperwork, to maintain a calendar, to do internet searches for apartments or for really any other services or things that he needs to get done. And, because of this, it's been really hard for him to complete the tasks he needs to go out and look for apartments in. He needs more time because of that. I've got ahead of myself. That does all three things. First, it introduces her or him, and it says who they are, what their experience is, what their skill level is, and how they know Aaron. And then it goes right into the next step where it explains what the effects of my impairment are. No, it didn't say that Aaron has a major depressive disorder. It didn't say Aaron has, a schizoaffective disorder. It didn't say he has a processing disorder. All it said was how it affected him, right? That he can't complete these tasks. He has trouble staying organized. He has trouble keeping a calendar. These are the effects of the impairment, and that's what's important. And to be able to give specific examples is really useful because it helps the person reviewing the request understand what's going on. So I think that's a great way to do it. And then the third step, so we introduce ourselves, credentials, experience with Aaron, the effects of the impairment, and then connecting it together. Now you've given some examples. Hopefully those examples of the effects are automatically link it to the accommodation that you're requesting, and then you specifically state that request, the accommodation that you're requesting, an extension to the voucher rent up period or an extra bedroom. So that's my 2 cents on the doctor's letter, the knowledgeable person's letter. And I think it is, if you have time and you're not under a lot of time pressure to get the accommodation done and in place, whether you're coming to CTI for an accommodation or asking for accommodations otherwise, this is one of the areas where you can exert the most, the most effective advocacy practices. So I've got a few resources that I want to go through. I included my general resources from the trainings just because I like making sure as many people have them as possible. I go through a few different sets. We got some CTI fair housing resources. We have some legal resources. We have some tenant and advocate tools, and then some more about just general housing assistance tools. This is how you can get in touch with us. It's got my office phone and cell phone on here. It's got our fair housing email, and it talks a little bit about the way we can help tenants. This page will help you find court information. If you need court information, it'll help you find your legal aid organization that provides housing assistance and a variety of other programs of assistance too, based on your geographic area in Massachusetts. And we also have some information on how to file housing discrimination complaints. These are some tenant and advocate tools that can help people complete paperwork if they have a housing code issue, if they have a pending eviction, or if they need restraining orders. There's also a great guide on here for fair housing for people with disabilities. Housing assistance programs include community action agencies that have housing consumer education centers and the RAFT program. These are all good places to look for community resources. Now here we get into really sort of the disability and reasonable accommodation specific stuff. And there's some great materials here developed by some top-notch legal aid organizations and by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, a federal agency that administers a lot of section subsidy programs like Section 8, and also has a fair housing division that enforces our fair housing laws. And they receive complaints on issues of reasonable accommodations not going the way they need to. There's some examples of doctor's letters in here, and these are also some tools that you can use to walk through the reasonable accommodation process. Our CTI rental assistance program is really familiar with these, but if you're doing this process with a housing provider that isn't, some of these are really nice to give out because they are written as much for a housing provider as they are written for a tenant. So it's something that you can hand to the housing provider to say, hey, let's work through this process together. Here is a neutral guide. It wasn't just a tenant advocacy guide. It's a neutral guide to help housing providers get it right too. So that is, and then here's just some more information about our fair housing program. That is the bulk of what I like to talk about when I describe the reasonable accommodation process to people. We are going to switch over now, and we're going to look at the reasonable accommodation form that CTI uses. And we're going to just take a few minutes and walk right through it and review how you can fill out this form most effectively so you don't run into any hiccups or hurdles. All right, give me a second. I need to switch my screen share here. Here we go. All right, I think this is going to work right. So this is Community Teamwork's reasonable accommodation form. You can get this in, you can pick them up at CTI. We can email them to you if you live farther away. But this is a great way to start the reasonable accommodation process at Community Teamwork if you need an accommodation the way we administer your housing subsidy. So the first section here is head of household information. It's pretty basic. It's important to get this on the form so we know who's asking for the accommodation, and so we make sure that it is linked to all our right client information. I will highlight here that it does include a place to put the name of the household member for whom you're asking for the accommodation from, right here on this gray household line. It might not be the head of household that needs the accommodation. It might be a child or a spouse. So we can put that in there. The next section does not have to be filled out. If you're getting help filling out the form, sometimes children of parents fill out forms, or a brother or a sister will help someone fill out a form. A social service person in the community might help fill out a form. I help fill out these forms, so I would put my name on it when I'm helping somebody fill out a form. That goes there just so CTI knows who's helping. It's a nice time to notice here that you do not have to, the individual that needs the accommodation does not have to be the person that starts the process or asks for it. So that's really important, that they don't have to be the one. They can get help asking for the accommodation. Now, once we got through these first two sections, the next one is really where all the action happens. And this is the reasonable accommodation request. And there's a couple parts to this one, just like the way we talked about it. And it's going to be oriented as the tenant burden parts, where we need to ask for the accommodation, connect it to an impairment, and describe the impairment. So the first one is enter the accommodation requested. It does not require a lot of information, but it is nice to be really specific and clear. So if the two examples we used was for an extra bedroom or for an extension to the voucher period. So if we needed an extension to the voucher period, it would say I have 60 days to find a new apartment after the termination of my last lease, and I couldn't find a place within that 60 days. I need an extension. And then we can move on to the next step. You put again here on number 2, the household member that needs the accommodation. I don't know why it's on there twice, but when I fill out these forms for folks, I put it in both times. And then we move on to the second step, which is connecting the request, which you put in number 1, to your impairment and the need for it. And they got 2 different spots to do this. One, the first box here, method of communication. This is really just for communication requests, and there are a lot of them. One really easy example might be, if somebody doesn't hear, if they're deaf and they need to do everything through emails and can't do phone calls, right? That would be a very easy one to explain and understand. Other communication impairments might be, I get really nervous on the phone. I have to do everything through email. But the 2 examples that we used in this presentation, fall into this second category of an adjustment to community teamwork's rules, policies, practices, and procedures. And this one has the most flexibility in it, and it can really cover any type of accommodation. Here, we would make it really clear what the effects of the impairment are, right? It is, I need accessible housing. I can't go out and look for housing very easily. It's hard for me to arrange rides. It's hard for me to, move around sidewalks in winter because I use a wheelchair. All these things that are holding me back in finding a new place. And that's why I need this extension, because I haven't been able to rent in the 60 days that I normally need to. One of the shortcomings, I think, of this form is that there's not a lot of space here to write it. And I think it gives a message that not much information is necessary. It does say, please be specific and use the other side of the paper. I like to type it out, and I almost write it the way we reviewed the doctor's letter. But getting it out is the most important part, whether you're doing it on the back side of the paper or not, but be specific. And I like using the examples of how the impairment affects you. I have trouble traveling. I have trouble finding accessible units. I have trouble arranging for rides. I have lots of medical appointments. Make that connection and then tie it into those, say those impairments and tie it in. This is really where all the action is. Now, moving on to the next couple parts here. This is a spot where you can list the person that's going to verify your impairment and its connection to your request. Often it's a healthcare provider that is sort of the best evidence standard. You can put your healthcare provider's name here, and then you can sign on the bottom, which authorizes community teamwork to reach out and call that healthcare provider. What I would do if I'm doing it like this, I would also include a fax number or an email, so you can send this release before reaching out to the healthcare, before CTI reaches out to the healthcare provider, because the healthcare provider might not take the phone call at all, because they won't even want to acknowledge that you're a client if they don't have that release in hand first. So include enough information, or you affirmatively take that step to tell the healthcare provider, give them a release, give them a copy of this, or have it so CTI can. The other thing is, healthcare providers are really hard to get in touch with, especially by phone. And overwhelmingly, I think it's more effective for clients or tenants to make the connection with their healthcare provider and get written documentation, rather than rely on this process where you're asking CTI to make the call. We will make the call, we will reach out, we can confirm it orally over the phone, but it can create delays in that accommodation being approved because of the back and forth trying to get in touch with the office. So I do really strongly recommend, having that written or documented support from your healthcare provider, or getting it after you submit the request and then submitting it to CTI. And that's the whole thing. That's the form. I'm going to stop my screen share, and I appreciate everybody's everybody that's watching this, hopefully it was useful for you. If you have specific questions about this process, you're not sure about some of the steps, you're welcome to reach out to our Fair Housing Program at Community Teamwork. We're in the Resource Center in our Housing Education Center at 17 Kirk Street. It's the same building as our rental assistance program, but it is around the corner. Um, you can you can put a request for assistance in online. If you go to our Fair Housing Program and our CTI website, there's an online form you can fill out and ask for assistance. You're also welcome to ask for help from folks up in our rental assistance department. If you have questions, they're a good place to ask also. Uh, I'm going to end the presentation now, and I hope this was useful for folks.